To the honourable member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In rising to speak on this important motion before the House, I congratulate the member for Ballarat for raising the issue and her personal insights, and it's particularly in the context that polio survivors continue to be the largest single disability group in Australia today. And like the previous speaker, I have met with the representatives from Polio Australia and sufferers from within my own electorate, and it's given me a better insight into the challenges that many Australians face. The epidemic of this terrible disease during the last century is certainly well known, Deputy Speaker, but the continuation of suffering by those affected has largely gone unnoticed in our modern society. Indeed, it's fair to say that polio is largely seen as a disease of a previous generation. There's a lack of understanding about the late effects of polio or post-polio syndrome and the impact the disease is having on many of our communities, or all of our communities today. Within our local communities, the effects of the disease continue to haunt many polio survivors and immigrants who contracted the disease before they actually arrived on Australian shores. Deputy Speaker, I don't suggest for a second that our medical professionals have been complacent with their recognition of the disease. I think we'd all agree there's been several other medical issues that have perhaps attracted more attention in recent years, and post-polio syndrome hasn't been recognised to the extent that it probably needs to be in the future. I believe perhaps this lack of recognition has taken away the emphasis the medical system has had on both previously had on eradicating polio, but also about providing adequate care for people going forward. And it's a case that Polio Australia has made it throughout their slogan, which is polio, forgotten but not gone. As I said, polio is seen as a disease of that previous generation, and it's a concern that many people are actually reluctant to talk about their experience and the effects the disease has had on them throughout their lives. Unfortunately, there remains a certain stigma that surrounds this terrible disease, which we as a society, I believe, have to try and overcome and actually remove if we're going to provide the assistance required in the future. I believe the lack of communication and financial support between the polio support groups and the community has probably actually contributed to a lack of funding across all levels of government to investigate and resolve many of the effects and the problems that are associated with post-polio syndrome. And indeed, I'm advised by the Parliamentary Secretary for Health that the Department of Health and Ageing doesn't currently provide any specific funding to support post-polio syndrome. The department's role under the current health funding arrangements is limited to providing grants to the state and territory governments, and they decide their own priorities. The effects and the problems of post-polio syndrome are continuing to grow as the majority of the polio survivors become older and more reliant on assistance from support groups and carers. Naturally, Deputy Speaker, as our polio sufferers age, their health needs will become more complex. And having met recently with Polio Australia, I understand the need for funding to assist the support groups that work with the sufferers of this disease. I was advised by the group there are approximately 40,000 people suffering from a paralytic form of the disease, and the number of people suffering from the non-paralytic form could be as high as 500,000. And importantly, there are forms of the disease that show symptoms similar to other medical ailments, which makes it even more difficult for the medical profession. And this can lead to people with the disease being misdiagnosed or undiagnosed completely. And such a failure, Deputy Speaker, to diagnose the late effects of polio or post-polio syndrome can lead to an inappropriate treatment, which the Polio Australia volunteers inform me actually can lead to a further exacerbation of the condition and an escalation of the symptoms for those sufferers. I think that there lies one of the most significant problems for Polio Australia is that on their database at the moment they have about 1,500 people, I understand, who are regarded as being affected by the disease and registered on their database. But they need to expand that and get a better handle on the actual number of people involved, and that's going to require funding. There's a significant amount of work that's being done on the ground by the support groups to meet the growing demands throughout regional communities. But a concern is that throughout all these support groups there's actually only one paid role in Victoria at the moment, and this lack of paid support is an issue for us in a range, I know, of medical conditions, but certainly in polio it's emerging as a major concern for Polio Australia. Polio Australia have argued, and I believe quite rightly so, that without the government's future support they'll have a further impact on the volunteers who are required, and also the burden that's falling upon these volunteers is probably too extreme for them, as particularly many of them are directly affected by the disease themselves. And I think they're right in their case to say that help is urgently required to help them support sufferers of polio, post-polio syndrome in the future. Too much of the burden is falling on the kind-hearted volunteers in our community. I believe it's essential that the federal government works with the polio support groups and encourages more volunteers and further assists organisations like Polio Australia in its endeavours. It's important that any services that are provided in the future are made available to people in rural and regional areas, and we take steps to overcome that tyranny of distance which prevents people from accessing services. And I commend the member for Ballarat again for bringing the matter to the House's attention.